Hi, welcome back to another TerranScapes video. This video is going to be part 2 of the Bragdon mold review. I'm reviewing a large rock mold, and the first part of this video, I'll put a little link right there, and I'm going to try and see how it works out. I forgot last video to put a little menu up here of the parts of the video if you want to skip around. And I am asking people, there's a phone ringing, I don't know if it's going to show up. I am asking people to not judge the molds until the end of this video. So watch the first video, watch this video, and then you'll understand my conclusions and some of the rationale that I give. So there's a lot I'm trying to talk about over at the bench. I already shot that segment, and it's kind of confusing because I'm trying to show you parts of the molds and keep it all in frame and find the parts I want to show you. You'll see. Anyway, there's a lot to talk about, so let's get over to the bench and I'll show you the molds. So it's probably best to start off examining the cast by examining the mold. And what I want to do is talk to you about a couple different types of issues and then see how that affects the progress of the casting as we go on along the way. So what I've done here first is I have marked the mold in a couple areas to help me find the spots, because otherwise I'm doing a lot of hunting. And I thought for the first part, let's take a look at the master's bubbles, right? So the mold was made from a master, all right? And in the master, when it was cast, if there are bubbles in the cast, okay, which will show as a dimple, then that will be a bump out in the mold when you make a mold, because the latex goes into the hole, and then when you pull it out, the texture is reversed, right? So we get bubbles. So, for instance, right here, okay, we can see some of those bubbles right there. And we can see some of those bubbles, for instance, in the tips in frame. That doesn't hurt. There we go. And we can see some bubbles in there as well. Now, just to take a look at what that correlates to, all right, so let me make sure I've got this right. Okay, so you gotta, right, it's inverted. I spent a little while actually marking all this and trying to match it all up. So hopefully it does save us some time on camera here. But as we saw in the tip here, all right, that corresponds to this spot here. And if we take a look, right, we can see those bubbles now showing in the cast. All right, so when we make the cast, the out bubbles make a dimple in the final product. And we can see those in this area as well, all right, looking around in there. Then I wanted to look at the second problem that you can have with a mold is not only from the master, but actually when you make the mold yourself. And when you well, if it's silicone, you pour it. That's what I'm used to. But with latex, if you're brushing on the rubber and the rubber doesn't get into, all right, the tiny cracks and crevices in there, you're going to end up with a bubble, all right, if you picture that, and that is going to look like an indent, okay, in the mold when you make a cast or when you make the mold from it. So for instance, all right, here you can see you can see the texture is different, right? You can see that something didn't get put in there when the rubber was pushed in. And you can see another area right here, all right? And let's see, oh, and I picked out another area which is in the frame right there. All right, so what does that produce in the cast? When you take the cast off of this mold, we end up with spots that are bumped out, if you will, and I marked ones on here that are the result of the mold. There are others on here, all right, but I have, which cast was, oh, this was my first pull. Okay, well, shows what I know. Some of these get worse as time goes on, but in any case, and we'll talk about that. This spot, all right, this spot corresponds to this spot, right? This is out, that's in. And you can see when I demolded it that there was something going on there. There was actually some bubbles sticking out, and I just picked them off with my finger. So you can see how the plastic was removed, and I'm exposing some of the urethane foam beneath it. And in this spot, okay, which is a deep crevice in the actual, it's a miss in the rubber in that crevice, that corresponds to this point here, okay? And when we look inside there, and this one, there we go. I'm just making sure. Oh, there we go. That's probably a little more helpful. All right, when we look in there, you can see there's a different texture, right? And it's kind of, it looks like almost it's been puttied in. All right, that's because the mold didn't fill it with rubber, and so this is what it looks like after you make a cast from that. So, and there's one, oh, we'll look at one more example. All right, so there's a spot right here where it didn't get the rubber in it, and what you see right here is there's a small defect in there, and that defect should look a little more like a bubble, but it doesn't quite, and that might be because I didn't fill it with enough plastic when I was making the cast, right? So sometimes there's defects when you actually make the cast, but in general, right, I'm just highlighting things that are unavoidable because of the way the mold was made. So when we look at later casts, all right, I'm going to set the mold aside. Those areas, because they have problems, can create a cascade where you start to increase the damage over cast because they start pucking out rubber out of the mold, and that begins to have some of these areas expand in problems. So let's see here. So when we take a look, I'll show you two. Now, I feel I have to make a caveat here, and I mentioned it a little bit in, no, I don't think I've mentioned it actually yet. I did not follow his instructions for the proper mold release. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end. He recommends petroleum jelly. I was not using petroleum jelly because I'm Mr. Smarty Pants here, and I was like, I could just use ease release. Well, no. I finally tried petroleum jelly, and it makes demolding it easier. So I have caused more damage to the mold that is exacerbated as I've continued to pull, right? This is my most recent pull from the mold, and it is much more damaged than the original, and I thought that all of that damage was because his molds weren't properly made. Some of that is, but a lot of it is me not using the right mold release. So I'm just going to focus on the areas where I know there was a problem right on the outset. All right, so let's look at the top one here. Again, we have this top spot, all right, and this was the first pull. And now when we go, we can see how that dimple is now becoming a bigger bubble, because every time I pull a cast from it, I'm tearing the rubber, and so that hole is getting bigger and bigger. Now remember, that hole might not be quite so big now if I was doing proper mold releasing, but you can see, and here's, so to be fair, here's another instance where there is a defect in the mold, and then you can see, all right, the defect here, and it has not expanded or gotten to be more of a problem. Depending on how the shape of the bubble is, and depending where it is in terms of the the texture, it can expand, or it may just stay the same over, you know, the life of the casting. It really depends. And of course, good mold release helps. Let's take a look at one more spot here. We'll take a look at this spot here. If you notice right here, okay, in this spot, there is a pretty rough texture in there. It's not a bubble per se, but it's got some pretty rough texture going on. So when we take a look at my cast, all right, we see in here it didn't really expand, all right. But if you look right below it, we start to see that that is starting to become a bigger problem as I go on with the casting. And again, that is part of the texture. If the bubble has an undercut, and it can trap rubber behind it because of its shape, then it's more likely to tear as you move along. And we see that here where this was my first cast, all right? And this was where I had to puck out some pieces, and there's quite a bit of stuff going on in there. And now that has really expanded into some areas that are going to need quite a bit of cleaning if you want to get a nice, you know, clean look on this. All right, so that's what I've been seeing with the Bragdon molds. And let's take a look at my molds and see how they have been doing in comparison to get a better sense of the quality of his, using my molds as a baseline for my own knowledge. So we'll start by taking a look at my mold. And I'm going to get my notes over here. A lot to keep track of. The first thing is the bubbles in the master, right? If you remember, bubbles in the master cause a little pop out in the actual mold because the bubble is an indent in the master. Now, to be fair, I spent a lot of time hunting down those bubbles and filling them. So there aren't many, all right? I don't know if that's a reasonable expectation of Mr. Bragdon. It has to do with his master control, but in any case, I went through and I filled a whole bunch of them. But I was able to find a couple that still remain, partly because I got tired of filling them at some point. I was like, it's okay if there's a couple. All right, so we see right in here, there's a little bubble right in there, all right? And that correlated to, oh boy, here we go. All right, there we go, right? Jesus. I am a nut. Anyway, there's the bubble right there. That was a lot of work to show you that little bubble. But anyway, there it is. And you can see on another spot, all right, that I also, Jesus, boy, you know what? I need a big open spot to move things like this around. All right, and you can see in the tip of these, right, there's a couple bubbles in there, and those were the ones that weren't filled in by the master. And taking a look at mold defects from the putting in the rubber, there aren't any because I put very, very thin coats to start with, actually pretty much the whole way. And by using very, very thin coats, you can really control and stipple it in to all the little cracks and crevices and little nooks and crannies, and that prevents any of those bubbles from forming. Mr. Bragdon is using a thicker layer to start with, and that is what is giving him some of the missing rubber in some of the cracks and crevices. However, there are some bubbles in my cast, creates a bubble in the cast. And if Mr. Bragdon was making a cast from a master mold, okay, so he's got his master mold and he's making a cast to make a new master, all right, then he's going to end up with bubbles in the tips, and the bubbles in the tips for this look like, here we'll take a little leap. You can actually see where I missed, all right, because in there, let's see, I think you can see that. Oh boy, it's a little hard because I got a bright light right in my eyes. So hopefully you can see there's a little tiny dimple of paint in there. Well, this one's a little bit better, all right. And you can see the paint dimple. That is where I spray painted it successfully, but I did not get plastic into that. And so that, we got a little flap there. I'm going to exacerbate it so you can actually see into it. All right, we've got this little dewlap there. Is that what they call it when it's a flap on an animal? Anyway, but notice when I let that go flat, look at how close that is to the surface now. That is going to be really tricky to get plastic into consistently, especially when you're trying to spread it by hand and get it all over this really quick before it starts setting up and, you know, smooth it all out. That's not easy. So that spot is going to cause problems in every cast, because this is never going to fix itself unless it tears, in which case then it's going to, you know, obviously have its own problem. Let's see here. I had a couple more spots to show. All right. Then we have some areas where you can see, and you might be able to see them from the big camera away here. You can see these little specks of orange. Boop, 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 boop. That's my orange sound effect, right? Boop, boop. Hopefully that's all. Yeah, it's a little bit more in frame, actually. All right, a little more close for me. This is where I actually pucked out rubber right from the first cast demolding it. You know, this is a little spot where it was very tight and it was very hard to get, you know, the cast off. Not the proper mold release. I might have avoided some of these, but I think some of these are unavoidable because of the aggressive texture of this rock surface. This has got lots of extremely tight nooks and crannies, and getting a perfect pull without tearing any of the latex, I had to really demold this very softly, very gently over, you know, it took me a while. It takes me time to pull the rubber off of this without damaging it because of its aggressive texture. And let's see if I marked it. And what's interesting, here we go. This is kind of an interesting thing. All right, so I pulled that off. That spot corresponds, okay, remember we're going in reverse. Let's see here. My gosh, this is so big. It's really difficult for me to keep everything in frame. All right, this spot over here corresponds to this spot because it's a mirror image. All right, so let me show you that spot, and you'll see, I think, one of the difficult things with monitoring the quality of the rubber. So here's the area where I tore some of the rubber out, and I had to actually map where this section was very carefully to find it because I can't see any torn rubber. I think that's right in here, but I can't be 100% sure. I mean, I could really try to, you know, map it all out and look carefully. But the point being is that if the mold gets a little damaged, it's kind of hard to see it from the mold itself. So, you know, should those little pucks occur down the road, you know, I set this mold aside. 6 months later, I pull it out because somebody ordered it, and I start pulling casts from it. It's not like I'm aware that it's got that damage, especially if the damage is accruing very, very slowly, right? These are not giant spots, okay? But every time I pull it, and I'll show you just a second what this is the first pull. I'll show you the third pull, and we'll take a look at that. So here's the third pull, and if you look, and hopefully this is going to show, but this camera, you know, it's got a great look, so meaning its eye is good. And it just looks good. You can see, right? I'm still pulling rubber. Third pull, I'm still getting little nooks and crannies of rubber out of it. Again, just because it's a lot of deep texture and it's very hard to not damage the rubber, you know, because it has to stretch so much to get out of these really, really tiny places. And as these get pulled, they begin to fill, and that will create, you know, either visual problems. It can also ease the future casts because now there isn't a super stupid little nook that needs to be, you know, gently removed if I can get it out at all. Okay, so my main point with this is to try and give some foundation to the Bragdon molds, in that some of the things we're seeing in the Bragdon molds are common things to mold making and pulling from the master and making subsequent casts for it. And we have to remember that what he's doing is he makes a cast. Hopefully you saw part one. If you have not seen part one, go see it right now, all right? Is that he's taking his cast, he's cutting it up, putting a few different pieces together, and then making a new mold from that. If he cuts up this cast, it's gonna have some of these bubbles when I had trouble making the plastic cast from the mold, right? You know me, I'm fastidious, I'm detail oriented, I'm finding these little micro bubbles, okay? So you know I care about these things and I'm still getting them. So what you end up with is if you keep making successive casts and you keep cutting pieces out, you're going to have some of those defects begin to become exacerbated. And I think that is partly what is happening with his molds. This is why he's most likely getting those initial problems. And I didn't realize that when I first started using the Bragdon molds. And as I got to cast, I don't know, this is like 15 on this mold. Probably right now we can see just a massive amount of problems all over the place. You know, these are being torn out of the rubber's being torn out of them, out of the mold. These bubbles are getting bigger and bigger. There's more and more tips that are, you know, missing holes, some from the master, some from my cast. And this, at this point, is, you know, really, to me, this is unusable. I did use them to make my master because that's all I had, but I had to, this is when I say I had to clean these to make that master, you know, here's a good spot where I wanted it, but needed to clean. Here we go. If you look in this channel in here, right, all of that I had to Dremel out. These areas here, I had to Dremel out. In here, okay, I had to smooth out all these bumps, you know, in here, clean this up. It really, really, really took a long time to get something usable out of this, and I've made a new mold of just this face so that I can go back to the start in terms of using this texture and you know, getting a good mold that I can cast from. So this damage is partly my fault. That's what I was trying to say earlier. It's the mold release. I wasn't using the proper one. It wasn't demolding as easy as it should, so I caused extra damage to it. Plenty of problems to start with the mold, but it doesn't help the mold when you do a technique that isn't favorable for this kind of texture especially. So now that you've seen me attempt to show you the problems with the molds, problems with the cast, comparing mine, comparing it to his. Hopefully you watch part one, because part one shows a little bit different way of looking at the molds and how I made mine and how he's making his and why that might be contributing to problems. I want to wrap it up with a sort of list of the bads, the goods, the neutrals, and then some things to consider when you're looking at these molds in terms of whether you might want to purchase them or not. So first, just to go over the bads quickly, the cons. The molds have damaged edges around them from the masters delaminating at the edges, and so you see that foam texture surrounding the mold, and that's reducing the amount of castable area that's functional. The bubbles in the masters are putting lots of little dimples in, particularly in a lot of the tips, but they can be in other areas, and so this may be part of him using some of the casts to cut up to make other molds from, so they may be accruing over time. It's hard to say. There's a limited selection on his site. When I spoke to him, he said he has numerous molds, many, many more than are shown there, so that's a bad, and the pictures of them are a bad because it's very hard to tell exactly what you're getting. And I thought I'd mention a couple fixes that would make all of these pretty much go away. And oh, and I forgot one more bad. the bubbles in the mold themselves. So when he's applying the latex, it's not getting into all of the deep cracks and crevices, and so that is causing a bubble in the mold, which is then showing up when you make casts. So what could be done to fix these? Very quickly, replacing the masters more frequently, especially if they're starting to show damage, and that will help with the bubbles as well, most likely. Making initial coats of the latex a little thinner, especially with some of these more difficult textures. This one is vastly different in terms of what I'm seeing compared to the previous one. There's a video in the Wayback Machine. I haven't done the Wayback Machine before. I can't find every link. You have to go and look for some of them, because doing this and doing that and doing this, I can't do it all. So in the Wayback Machine, that's the back finger, you'll see the first rock mold I did a review of. And an extra bonus would be to fill some of the deepest texture that's likely to cause problems, both for the mold making and for the casting. I did that on my master. I went in and I was like, that is too deep. I'm going to fill it a little, just so I have a better chance of getting the rubber out without tearing it, and also an easier time demolding future casts. So that would be an extra, not a requirement, but an extra. And an extra would be to finish the edge of the wall with like a clay dam. That's what I did. I mounted it on clay and made a little lip, and that's just going to make it look nice around the edge, and it helps when you're casting, because then when you're tipping it around, getting all the rubber everywhere, it doesn't spill out. I'll talk about at the end, though, how he really uses these and why that might not work for him. So let's talk about the goods. The good is that they are reasonably durable molds if you use the right mold release. I'll talk about that again in just a tiny second, but I'm looking ahead. No, I guess I better talk about it now. You really need to follow his directions in using petroleum jelly. I used Ease Release, which is a spray-on mold release to the start, up to this point, up to recently. I'm going to leave that in. And it really doesn't release it well enough. I used petroleum jelly on a cast, and I noticed a big, big difference. Then I tried, just as a comparison, to use paste wax, bowling alley wax, which is very common for mold release, and it works, but not as well as petroleum jelly. So I've been brushing in petroleum jelly very thinly over it to preserve the texture, and it makes a big difference. So that's the good. Fairly durable. Less so with the more difficult texture, but that's to be expected. Another good, amazing textures. The textures that he's putting out as available are, I haven't seen any like this, and the sizes of the molds that he offers are really astounding. The mold I made, right, is about the size of his maximum molds that I saw. And so that's a big, big mold. And it's got a lot of functions that are just not easy to do any other way. His molds have the areas filled with more latex, which gives them a nicer feel and body, and they're thicker, so they don't need a shell, and they're a little bit easier to handle. Mine's a little thin, and it feels a little, when I'm trying to spread plastic in it. So that is a bonus for his, the way he's thickened them up. He has very nice personality and customer service. When you call him, if you do, I spoke with him at length, and I was just really taken in by, he's very approachable, and he's a single man business or couples business, so you get that personal level of attention, question answering, and he also offers to do custom molds. So if you want to do a 10 foot by 10 inches, right? 10 foot by 10 inches rock face. He'll make a mold specifically for that, which is a nice service. Pricing? Not so sure, but it's possible if you want that. If you cast into these molds the way he does, all right, plastic, foam, backing, this produces the most lightweight, literally flexible. You can heat them and bend them, and trimmable. When they're soft, you can actually go around with scissors and cut sections off. This is a fantastic development for me in casting, and it's a credit to him for bringing this forward to the community. So his casting technique not only is just awesome for everybody to know, but it is an optimum way to use these large scale molds, and that's a big bonus on its own. Second, another bonus, he makes them so you don't have to, because making latex molds is time consuming. It took me a long time to make the latex molds that I made, and having somebody else do that is worth something. And really, that kind of comes into the price, which is the last pro. I think the prices for these molds are very good. For the size you're getting, for the textures he's offering, the price that he's offering is very good. I think it's very competitive, and it's hard to compare his price to others because I don't know of anybody else offering this kind of a product. It's very unique. So I'm going to leave it as a pro. I had a couple neutrals, and the first neutral is that he has a limited selection on the site and really poor photos of the pieces, and that's in the bad column, and it's also in the neutral column, and it really depends on your weighting of that. I personally like to scrutinize the things that I'm going to buy extremely carefully, and I really would love to see many, many more of the molds on his site and be able to look at them in a very high level of detail, nice HD picture to really see what you're getting. So for me, it's a bad, but I think for most people, it's probably a neutral. And the other thing that's a neutral is really the way he's arranging the pieces to create his his mold, right? He's assembling sections of rock, filling them in, putting pieces on top. If you like the look or you don't, it's really going to be personal preference, and I think of that as a neutral. So in wrap up, what are some final considerations really to think about if you're interested in this kind of a mold? One is that in terms of its quality, really, right? Because that's what we're really talking about. It's difficult to mold these kinds of textures. It's not easy to do a texture like that. So that's something to keep in mind. How does your use affect the quality you need? A railroad layout, which is what these are designed for, may have a 10-foot long wall, like I said, 10, 15, 20 inches high. That's a lot of area to cover, and it's often not right up front for viewing by the onlookers. All right, a lot of times it's set a little back. It may not, but it could be, and so it's going to hide some small imperfections that way. So, if you're doing meticulous up-close work, then there's going to be some cleanup that's needed. That's the way it is. And really, it's tied into how many pulls you expect to get from the mold. How many do you need? All right, with a more difficult texture like this, getting 2 pulls off of it, it's not a problem. Getting 10, 15 like I did, it's just not going to hold up well because of the texture that these molds have. If you want to do a lot of pulls, you might pick a texture that has less deep cuts in it. And if you're going to do a large scale railroad layout, that might be a consideration because you want 10, 15, 20, 50 pulls from it, right? And you want to pick something that's going to last a little bit more. So that is something to consider when you judge whether these molds are of good quality and and worth of your purchase. And it's also important to remember that he has an individual business model. And that business model is based on what kind of volume he wants to produce, what are his material costs, how much labor is he interested in putting into them, and what kind of profit is he looking for. So when I think about these molds and whether they're good or they're bad, it's really a little dependent on that consideration. And if he's looking to make rapidly available, low-cost molds, and in order to do that, he needs to rip out the latex layers to get them out, then it makes a little more sense about the kinds of quality that are, that's being produced. For me, I would be willing to pay more for these molds if they were in pristine condition, meaning no bubbles, no defects in the rubber, and a little bit more tidying between the pieces as he's joining them. I'd pay double for a mold if it met those criteria. But I maybe am not the target audience. He brings these molds primarily to railroad shows, and he sells them primarily in person. So the website is a secondary consideration for him, and he's not really targeting wargamers, and so it's a different market, different demand by audience, different kinds of prices they're willing to pay. So it's really, it makes it something that makes it a little hard to judge it outright as, this is the quality I expect, this is where it's short, I think that in my final personal opinion, right? Did that look personal opinion? The textures that he's offering, the sizes of these molds, there's nowhere else you can get them that I know of. And I think for their price, for the quality you're getting, and for the variety that's available, I think I would give them a strong recommendation. There's problems with them, no doubt about it, but they're problems, if you really are interested, you can fix. And I think the value is there the way they're produced. Like I said, I'd pay more for better, but it's hard to beat the prices he's offering. And I think the pricing and the size and the quality are fairly well stitched together to make it a recommendation for a purchase. So hopefully this helped you, and it needed some extra detailed looking at, so I hope you found that helpful. I'll put a link to Mr. Bragdon's site, Bragdon Enterprises, in the description down below. If you have questions and comments, always feel free to leave them down below. I will answer any question you give me, and I'm eager to. And a lot of times your questions and comments teach me something, so I always value them. So stay tuned to the channel, because the next video, if you can stomach it, is one more video on these rock faces, but it's going to be in a totally different way. And I'm going to talk to you about how I'm actually going to be using them on the ocean boards for the islands in this ocean board project that I have been working on. So hopefully you'll come back and keep an eye on the channel, because I will be back soon with another TerranScapes video. This is big, so hopefully I can't get it much closer than this. So hopefully, all right. I didn't think about this when I was setting up the camera angles. My goodness. Well, it's a good learning lesson for me here. We'll all look at this together. Okay. And I've got it. Can edit. We can also see that oh my God, I can't freaking map this in my mind.